President Biden's withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan has been condemned across the world as catastrophic and incompetent, horrifying America's allies and delighting its enemies. The UK has launched its hydrogen strategy, and the SNP in Scotland say that they want to make their emergency COVID powers permanent. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. This week has all been about Afghanistan, specifically the extraordinary collapse of the government in Kabul as the US forces beat a hasty retreat care of President Joe Biden. Biden has tried to tough this one out, making confident and unapologetic interviews defending the action. But ultimately, given the appalling consequences on the ground, that has been hard to credit, and particularly because only weeks ago, Biden was saying definitively, unequivocally, this was not going to happen. And definitely there would be no helicopters airlifting people from the embassy roof as they did in Vietnam. Well, in that he was correct, because at the Kabul embassy, the helipad is on the lawn. But in every other way, he was exactly and absolutely wrong. Just a week before it all went wrong, Biden said that the Taliban takeover was not inevitable. And he said this:
because you have the Afghan troops have 300,000 well-equipped as any army in the world, and an air force against something like 75,000 Taliban. It is not inevitable.
Presidencies can get defined by certain images, and for Joe Biden, one of the ones that will enduringly mark his presidency will be footage of desperate Afghans falling off of American planes taking off from Kabul airport. It's very hard to watch that and say, yep, this is exactly how it was all supposed to go. Where did it go wrong? Well, Biden said what needed to be said, that the buck stopped with him. But, by the way, it was Trump's fault, and the Afghan military's fault, and the Afghan government's fault. Oh, and did he mention Trump, by the way? Now, it is true that Trump's administration started the surrender to the Taliban. The deal that Trump made with them put them on notice that America was going to be leaving, and by all reports, from that point on, they started preparing the groundwork for what would happen when they did. And particularly letting the people know what would be expected of them when the Americans weren't around anymore. Anatol Lieven, who was a journalist in Afghanistan for a number of years, put it like this in an article for Politico: this dense web of relationships and negotiated arrangements between forces on opposite sides is often opaque to outsiders. Over the past 20 years, US military and intelligence services have generally either not understood or chosen to ignore this dynamic as they sought to paint an optimistic picture of American efforts to build a strong, loyal Afghan army. So yes, the process of capitulation started with Trump. He and his supporters claim that it wouldn't have played out like this if he was still in charge. Maybe they're right, but he was so unpredictable in execution that frankly nobody knows. But Trump hasn't been president for more than half a year. And it was after Biden declared in April that US forces would be withdrawing that, according to the Washington Post, the capitulation started to snowball. And indeed, Biden himself went on to undermine the Trump blame story by agreeing that he would have sought a withdrawal from Afghanistan in much this same way, regardless of whether Trump had started the process or not. Now, in any case, none of it matters. The world has been watching what has been an ugly mess, and that has been wholly and completely undermining Joe Biden's message about what his objectives have been. First of all, he declared to world leaders, America's back. It wasn't quite what people imagined he meant. I mean, no NATO allies were involved in this move. By and large, they've been warning the administration that this sort of thing would exactly result in this outcome. Norbert Röttgen, the chairman of the German Parliament's Foreign Relations Committee, said this: I say this with a heavy heart and with horror over what is happening. But the early withdrawal was a serious and far-reaching miscalculation by the current administration. This does fundamental damage to the political and moral credibility of the West. And the whole point of America's back was supposed to be that European leaders who, during the time of Trump, had seen the America First agenda and begun to argue that they needed their own approach to security, one that was independent of America. That was supposed to be Biden saying, no, we're committed to the alliance. We are still the leader of the free world. Well, what everybody agrees right now is that America's leadership has been weak and incompetent. And its commitment to the alliance was so strong, Biden didn't even reference any of the European partners, including the UK, who had fought alongside Americans in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. Right now, British forces are trying to fly people out of Kabul. They have desperate Afghan women trying to throw their babies over the barbed wire to the soldiers on the other side, begging to get them out to safety. Mostly the Taliban is preventing people from getting through to the airport, stealing their passports and other documents, beating them if they try to get past. As a result, while tens of thousands of people are desperate to get out, some flights are leaving nearly empty, as reported in this story showing a picture of a nearly empty plane. It seems completely unclear what happens to Americans and Brits who are in Afghanistan who don't manage to get out by the end of the month. But according to Biden, this is all going pretty much according to plan, really. And now you have to feel for the Afghan people. Bear in mind, the median age of a citizen of Afghanistan is now 18.4 years old. So the majority of people in the country have never lived under the Taliban. They don't know what that means, or at least they didn't. Young women who grew up and were educated over the last 2 decades now face a future where they can't show their faces, can't be outside without a man if they're lucky. The unlucky ones will be forced into marriage, a process which involves being raped and then having to marry your rapist. And that's assuming you don't just end up as a full-on sex slave. Now, of course, the Taliban have said it's not going to be like that at all. They've changed. They'll even hold a press conference and answer journalists' questions, which is more than the leader of the free world will do after all. Meanwhile, the first reports have started coming in of people who acted as translators being shot and women being attacked. And as soon as the Americans and British have finally packed up and left, what do we really think is going to happen here? Now, how much damage will this do to Biden? In principle, the majority of agreements agreed with him that it was time to pull out of Afghanistan. Former National Security Advisor for Donald Trump, H.R. McMaster, said that it wasn't surprising that the public felt that way. For the past 3 different administrations, nobody had ever suggested that Afghanistan was anything other than a mess and a burden. But, he said, America's presence in Afghanistan, similar to its presence in Korea and Germany and other places, was about remaining vigilant in areas where its enemies could easily emerge. If the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, the US had learned through experience that it was better to be vigilant in the territories where the enemies were, rather than to wait for them to come to US soil and to fight them there. Well, you can argue that either way, but right now nobody's arguing that if America was right to withdraw, that this was the competent way to do it. And that strikes to the core of Biden's proposition to the American people, because he sold himself to America as the anti-Trump, meaning overall competent, reliable, and experienced and an expert on foreign affairs. Americans may have wanted to see troops come home from Afghanistan, but it can't benefit Biden's chances, and especially his party's chances in the midterm elections, when he's been shown up before the world as incompetent, unreliable, and pretty much incapable on the world stage. Now, you should never assume that what happens in the immediate aftermath of some disaster like this, that necessarily turns into a long-term effect. In the short term, Biden's approval rating dropped by 7% to its lowest ever level, down at 46%. But opinion was more divided over what should have been done about Afghanistan. Still, you can't escape the vision of Biden insisting that the Afghan army was well trained and well equipped, and this definitely wasn't going to be Saigon, and then being proven catastrophically wrong. People must be aware that America right now is the focus of anger and horror from the majority of the global community, except amongst its most powerful enemies, who are beside themselves with glee at this symbol of America's weakness. And if you add that to the missteps at home with the self-created border crisis and the growing evidence of inflation, well, you can see how it can go wrong. Now, in a minute, we'll talk about how the events of this week may give America's enemies the opportunity to drive home their advantage. And we'll look at some of the rest of the week's news. But first, there's still a pandemic, and lots of things are happening. Israel and elsewhere are now suggesting that the vaccine effectiveness wears off after what's a relatively short period of time. The countries committed to zero COVID are struggling to ward off the Delta variant, and there are big questions about whether the whole idea of zero COVID has simply now become impossible, and the number of deaths in England and Wales is reported to be at a, quote, highly unusual level. Some are suggesting it's because of the heat wave. Is it really? Well, we're going to be looking at all of these COVID-19 related updates in the video to go live on Monday on this channel, 7 p.m. UK time. Join me for that. 3 countries that have been particularly enjoying America's discomfort have been Russia, China and Iran. And as America has been about to exit, China and Russia particularly have been quick to embrace the Taliban as the new rulers and to seek to maximise their advantage. Some of this is certainly based on a defensive posture. So, for instance, the thing that China least wants is for the Taliban to permit Uyghur rebels to use Afghanistan as a safe staging post for attacks against the CCP. But that isn't half of the joy that America's perceived weakness brings the party, because pretty much the first thing that it did was to turn to Taiwan and to goad them that their reliance on American support would see the same weak outcome when it came to defending Taiwan's territory. Hu Zhijin, the editor of the Global Times, which is a mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party, tweeted this: "After the fall of the Kabul regime, the Taiwan authorities must be trembling. Don't look forward to the US to protect them. Taipei officials need to quietly mail order a 5-star red flag from the Chinese mainland. It will be useful one day when they surrender to the PLA. Laughing emoji." Indeed, possibly the most sinister laughing emoji of all history. This is a rather important, large-scale knock-on effect because it's not remotely far-fetched that China's assumption that America is too weak to follow through on its promise to Taiwan has just been confirmed, at least in the minds of Xi Jinping and the Chinese military. In a world where America is the world's policeman and prepared to stand by its allies, that is one where precipitate action carries enormous risks to China. But in a world where America is minded towards America first, where its people are increasingly obsessed with microaggressions at home and are averse to lengthy and costly wars overseas, you might say that they would feel more confident in testing the boundaries. Xi Jinping has stated repeatedly that it is his settled will that in the near term, China will reabsorb Taiwan. And I can't help but recall the historian Neil Ferguson's words about how the world wars came about when one side mistakenly believed in the lack of resolve on the other. He identified this very flashpoint, that China would make that assumption about America in relation to Taiwan, and that would lead to the opening of a hot war between them. Unless, of course, they're right. And Joe Biden and the American nation actually will no longer stand up to anyone unless it's in defense of their own territory. Republicans were quick to make exactly this point, of course. Donald Trump Jr. was one of those to rub it in. Whatever China's timeline was before on trying to seize Taiwan, we all know they're licking their chops now, knowing that there will never be a weaker US administration in power. This isn't a partisan issue. We've got to get tough before things really escalate. What China would like to do, of course, is to achieve the same effect that the Taliban achieved, to convince their targets that the end is nigh and resistance is futile, so they should start making their accommodations in the face of those overwhelming odds. Taiwan is not, however, the Afghan government. Its military is well equipped, but also well trained and entirely committed to their own defence. But they will be doing the equation. What are their options if this continuation in the spirit of Trump's foreign policy spills over to them? On Tuesday, China upped the pressure by conducting live fire drills in the sea and airspace in the vicinity of Taiwan. Just drills. No pressure. Meanwhile, others have been wondering whether, apart from the hellish existence now being forced on the Afghan people, whether this means that in quick order al-qaeda will be back in business, using Afghanistan as their base for operations. Well, it's not impossible. Certainly a number of people are suggesting that it's not as likely as some think. For one thing, the Taliban know that the last time they allowed al-qaeda free rein, it led for America to push them out of power for 2 decades. They'll be keen not to have that happen again. However weak America's leadership may be, if al-qaeda were to start representing a genuine threat to America again, you could expect action would follow. And it's not as though the Taliban were fans of the sort of terrorist attacks that Osama bin Laden's organisation was engaged in. But also it has been suggested that al-Qaeda's focus has very much turned more inwards in some of the territories where it's currently based, and it's much less likely to aspire to the strikes of the US than it was. Well, let's hope so. US intelligence hasn't been wholly on top of things in recent months. In the meanwhile, the UK has begun the process of filling in some of its net zero policy detail in the run-up to the COP26 summit later this year. Specifically, it's launched its hydrogen strategy. According to the government, hydrogen will be critical for achieving the UK net zero target and will consequently see a massive expansion, perhaps up to a full third of energy produced by 2050, which is pretty big ambitious goals given that they're starting from as good as zero. The Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, Kwasi Kwarteng, tweeted that the hydrogen strategy would kickstart an entire industry, unleash the market to cut costs, ramp up domestic production, unlock £4 billion of private capital and support 9,000 jobs. Sounds massive, but it starts slowly. Just 1 gigawatt production capacity by 2025, which of course is the lifetime of this parliament, but then rapidly expanding after that point. As I mentioned before, some of the early hydrogen production is going to be so-called blue hydrogen, which is made from natural gas and with carbon capture. It's not zero greenhouse gases because there's some methane leakage, and carbon capture doesn't currently remove 100% of emissions. There was a report recently that suggested that blue hydrogen was worse for the climate than coal. That report came under significant criticism, for instance from the Committee on Climate Change head of carbon budgets, David Joffe, who observed that this study had gone out of its way to cherry-pick the worst possible performance in order to make its case. Basically, the paper's calculations potentially represent a case where blue H2 is done really badly and without any sensible regulations, and then cherry-picked a climate metric to make it look as bad as possible. He observed that blue hydrogen saves 85% of emissions on a direct comparison with natural gas. That point notwithstanding, many argue that net zero energy supply needs to exclusively use green hydrogen produced with the use of renewable energy. The government strategy commits it to a twin-track approach, where it develops the capacity for both, at least in the early stages. Given the relative scarcity of hydrogen, particularly in the early stages, the expectation is that the industry will take top priority, since there are industrial processes for which hydrogen would be the only low-carbon fuel option. That may then be expanded to things like heavy goods vehicles, shipping and aviation, may be used as part of the storage backup for a grid that uses more intermittent sources, wind and solar power. Can the government deliver on such a massive kickstart for a new industry? With solid ongoing commitment, smart action, significant resources? Probably. Does it have any of those things? Well, some are understandably sceptical. Now, in a minute, we'll have a look at a final news item and then the thought for the week. But first, it's time for another Q&A video. I've invited my Patreon supporters to give me their questions, and there's already a good crop of responses coming through there, some really interesting questions. If you would like to add a question to be considered, add it in the comments below this video. Start your comment with the word question in all caps, so that even I can't miss it. Patreon supporters get guaranteed replies for at least one question each, but hopefully for all questions, and I will try to take as many as I can from here as well. And then join me for that video, going live on this channel at 7 PM UK time on Wednesday. See you then. In other news this week, the SNP-led Scottish Government has said that it wants to make its emergency COVID powers permanent. As things stand at the moment, the majority of its emergency powers will lapse in March 2022, although there's the ability for the Scottish Parliament to agree for a 6-month extension if that would be required. But now the government is consulting on making the powers enduring so that ministers can respond effectively and rapidly to any future threats to public health in Scotland. Deputy First Minister John Swinney said that measures that were no longer needed would be removed, but those with demonstrable benefit to the people of Scotland should be held onto. How the SNP defines what is or is not of demonstrable benefit remains something of an open question. Included in the powers would be the ability to limit the number of people in gatherings, introducing lockdowns, closing schools and requiring face masks. Scottish Conservatives said that the move was a clear sign that the SNP was unwilling to give up its control over people's lives. It's been often noted through the course of a pandemic that governments in history that took emergency powers have traditionally been very slow to give them up. I dare say this may become something of a wider theme across the world over the coming year. The ancient philosopher Plato had a vision for the ideal state. But in order for it to work, it depended on what Socrates described as the noble lie. The noble lie was a story that benign rulers told their subjects, true or false, that would get them to behave well. I suppose you could suggest it was like the nudge unit of its day. Plato's noble lie was the idea that God created people with different metals in their souls, which had the effect of assigning them their roles and their class in society, which they should therefore accept without complaint. You'll have noticed the Taliban have kind of the same concept going on for the role of women in society. I mean, no one's referring to that as a noble lie. Nobility obviously lies very much in the eye of the beholder. But that notwithstanding, is it ever appropriate to sell a story on the basis that it creates better outcomes, a false story? I mean, it's well established in a number of fields of human endeavour that it can be an extremely effective tool, particularly in the realm of personal performance. A man who believes himself to be talented, charismatic, attractive and behaves accordingly will enjoy more social success, regardless of whether those things are genuinely true, than someone who tells themselves that they're ugly and assumes that everyone hates them. Now, they may not be as successful as someone for whom those things genuinely were true, but they'd still be more successful than if they didn't believe those particular untruths. Let's be clear, every nation is founded on a story that to some extent is a noble lie. Nations are just shared stories that we tell ourselves that tend to accentuate the positive self-image that we have, and they are powerful and cohesive in that way. If you're proud of your country, you've already bought into some level a noble lie. And every culture of the past ran on similar concepts, along with every religion, of course. The question then becomes, how expansive is that concept allowed to be before it stops being so noble, particularly in the modern age? In our modern technological society, is it really that we've just become aware of the lies and we're no longer willing to believe in them, even if we benefit by doing so? I was criticised recently by an ecology researcher for my video on the insect apocalypse. He started by accusing me of getting my facts wrong, but of course I didn't. He jumped to various assumptions because he'd made the assumption that if you were kicking back against extreme insect apocalypse stories, then you must be arguing that everything was okay and nothing was declining, which is not at all what I said in that video. And eventually it became evident what was really burning his goat was that he felt the message, kicking back against overclaiming, was not helpful to the cause. That it might feed those who do argue that we should do nothing, which meant by implication he was happy with the lie about the insect apocalypse threatening human extinction, which he waved aside as a typical media exaggeration. That was okay as an untruth because at least it encouraged people to support the right actions. I happen to believe that to be a flawed application of any justified principle of the noble lie. Probably why I get kickback from people on both sides of the issues that I cover here. The noble lies that we might choose to tell ourselves about our sense of identity with a view to living up to an ideal, that's one thing. Tolerating lies and exaggerations about the nature of a practical problem that we have to solve is in a wholly different category. It is functionally stupid to believe that we should deal with anything but the nuanced truth with all of its uncertainties in that sort of situation. Because nothing undermines the determination to take action faster than the realization that those advocating for action have actually been lying to you. All of this reminded me this week what a difficult niche it is that I'm trying to fill here. I recall when I did a video criticising the BBC for climate activism, and he got quoted approvingly on one of the climate skeptic blogs. And immediately someone jumped in and said, "You don't want to approve of him? He debunks videos on Tony Heller." Yes, I do, or at least I did. And then this week, Ken Rice mentioned his discussion with me on Wednesday's video on his blog. And that prompted the person I've just been talking about to jump in and say, "This Mallen Baker is terrible. He did this video on the insect apocalypse and suggested that insects are not in decline." Which, of course, is not what I said. It reminds me of something I heard. I can't attribute it now. But we are in an era where we have a snap-to-guide set of judgments. There are two sides, and as soon as you spot an argument, you can sort it according to which side owns that argument, and then you can judge the rest of the content accordingly because you now know whether you approve of it or you disapprove of it. It makes it hard to have any kind of nuanced discussion at all. Also, of course, to build a committed audience if you're not going to play by that game. But you know, it is worth a try. And besides, my innate ability to piss off both sides of any argument is my only legitimate superpower. I'm certainly not going to give it up at this stage. But that makes it all the more important that I give my thanks to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Thanks to that support, I'm able to spend the time researching and producing videos. Feel free to focus on the topics that really matter, regardless of whether YouTube wants such topics monetized or not, and which side of the divide might be upset at me. If you would like to help me to continue making these videos, taking your place amongst the growing community of Patreon supporters, please head over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.